Hello and welcome to this special edition of Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers here on Al-Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on the programme, breaking news from Syria. Bashar al-Assad, who inherited power in 2000, has fled Damascus, bringing to an end more than half a century of his family's rule. His whereabouts remain unclear. Assad's departure follows on from the surprise territorial advance of opposition fighters. Led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they entered Damascus on Saturday evening. Hello and thank you for joining us for this special programme dedicated entirely to events in Syria, where the government of President Bashar al-Assad has fallen. Well, this follows on from rapid territorial advances by opposition fighters in recent days. Well, on Saturday evening, the opposition forces entered Damascus, having captured key Syrian cities such as Homs, Hama and Aleppo in the preceding days. Well, taking to state television this morning, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group which led the push to oust Assad from power, called on the Syrian army in Damascus to stand down. Well, the HTS leader said that the Syrian Prime Minister Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali will remain in office pending an official handover. Well, it's been reported that 59-year-old Assad took a flight from Damascus and left the country. Well, this morning, Syrian state television cut off its broadcast and published a still of a short written statement. It read, "The Syrian revolution has triumphed and the Assad regime has fallen." It also said that the military and the Syrian government had confirmed cooperation in order to manage the transition to the country's next stage. Well, the leader of the Syrian Military Operations Administration, Ahmad Ashara, who used to be referred to as Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, has ordered forces not to approach official institutions in Damascus, stating that they will remain under the Prime Minister's authority until they are officially handed over. Well, the Syrian opposition coalition also announced in a statement that work will be done to transfer power to a transitional governing body with full executive powers and authorities. Well, the United States will continue to maintain its presence in eastern Syria and says that it will take measures that are necessary to prevent a resurgence of ISIS. Well, speaking at the Manama Dialogue Security Conference in Bahrain on Sunday, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Daniel Shapiro, called on all parties to protect civilians, particularly minorities. They also urged that international norms be respected. Well, speaking to this channel, Al-Arabiya, the Syrian Prime Minister Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali said that he had had no contact with Bashar al-Assad since yesterday evening. He added that he had no information on Assad's whereabouts. Well, al-Jalali went on to tell Arabiya that he always hoped that there would be a settlement there in Syria. Well, some of the most striking images of today show the reality of the insides of the prison facilities used by the Syrian authorities under Bashar al-Assad. Well, today, HTS fighters broke into the jail on the outskirts of Damascus, the notorious Sednaya prison, which has become a byword for the darkest abuses of the Assad era. Well, amongst the hundreds of prisoners released were mothers and their children.
صرتوا احرار يلا كل واحد على بيته يلا 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 عمو لا تخافوا كل واحد على بيته لا ملجأ ولا شيء يلا لا لا تخاف لا تخاف يا عمو لا تخاف يلا كله على بيته لا تخافوا لا حدا له شيء عندكم يلا لا تخافوا لا تخافوا يلا الكل ما في معك في دولة يا أختي تعال يلا انزلي عمو انزلي تعال تعال اللي ما بده يطلع يضل ايه ايه حرام محجوزة حريته.
Well, I'm here throughout the duration of this program with Riad Kahwaji, who is Al-Arabiya's military and defense expert. Thank you so much for joining us here in the studio. In your opinion, is this the end of Syria's 13-year-long conflict, or is this just the beginning of a new chapter of it?
It's very hard to tell right now. I mean, usually when you have so many players on the ground, you have the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, then you have the Kurdish fighters up in the northeast part of the country. You have also the factional situation, you have the sectarian issues, you have so many variables on the ground. It's very hard to tell how easy is going to be this transition. Is going to remain peaceful? What parties would be invited now to become part of this political process of this transition? The more inclusive, the more assuring it will be that we're going to see a more peaceful, continue this peaceful, tranquil process. So the more exclusive, the more violent it could potentially become. For now, the assuring thing is that this force, which managed within 12 days to bring down the regime, has sent out very clear messages. It's rebranding itself as a nationalist movement away from the Islamist image that it used to have. Still, many people are suspicious, have not really showed much confidence, but they could offer it a chance to see. I think this will all depend on how smooth and reassuring they are in their measures they will undertake in the next few days.
All right, Riad, stay with us, because I just want to bring into the conversation Mick Mulroy, who is the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East and the Pentagon's former top policy official for the Middle East, who joins us now from Montana. Thank you so much for being with us. I mean, what we've seen on our screens the last 24 hours would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. What was your first reaction to these events of the last 24 hours?
Your sound cut off.
Just repeating that question. We've seen some unthinkable scenes on our screens the last 2 weeks, even more so perhaps in the last 24 hours. What are your immediate thoughts?
Well, good to be with you, my fellow guest in your audience. And I would agree, a lot hinges on what actually happens, not necessarily what is said. You know, yes, of course, a group that the U.S. has designated as a foreign terrorist organization is going to say it moderated itself if it intends to govern a country. But the actions will speak louder and worse. And I also agree that a lot of how this turns out, whether it is a peaceful transition or a very violent one, really depends on whether it is inclusive of all the groups in Syria that should have a stake at the table or largely won't join. So it's not only important to do so to stop the violence, it's important for practical reasons to create a governing coalition that will be recognized eventually by the international community. So I would also say that this not only was unexpected about how fast this moved, but I think for many, especially in the West, it was unexpected in its entirety. They just didn't think this was going to happen. Looking back at it, one could see that there was issues that could have caused this, of course, because Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah all have wars that they have to deal with themselves, and were not able to support the Assad regime the way they had been. So there was indicators, but I still do think it was unexpected, both in its actual genesis and its speed of which it moved to the collapse of the Assad regime.
In terms of how Washington views all of this, we've heard from the White House that President Biden is closely monitoring the situation. We've heard from the incoming president, the president-elect Donald Trump, saying this isn't America's fight. What's your reading of how Washington views this entire situation?
That is a good question, because Washington could view this two very different ways. The traditional way, including the first Trump administration primarily, was that the U.S. needed to be there to support our partners in the SDF, the Syrian Defense Forces, not only defeat ISIS, but ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. And that required forces, U.S. forces, about 900 in eastern Syria right now. That became contentious in the first Trump administration, with many wanting to pull those forces out. Ultimately, the side that wanted to stay obviously won the day, because they are still there. And the Biden administration has kept them there because I think they see the value in our support to that key element that, of course, is ensuring the enduring defeat of ISIS, their attacks have increased, and they likely will view this as a means to reconstitute themselves. So the question will be, well, whether a second Trump administration will again see the value in this U.S. force presence there, at least when it comes to fighting ISIS, also as a balancing factor, or will they go with their isolationist wing and pull out forces, which I personally think would be a very bad idea. But ultimately, that's going to be made by the incoming team, and I'm sure there's going to be a healthy debate when it comes to that issue.
There's been reaction to these developments from right across the world, in particular from regional leaders here in the Middle East. I mean, what, in your opinion, are the possible implications for not just Syria's neighboring countries, but the region as a whole?
So I think the region is if it wasn't tense enough already, it is increased exponentially. Why? Because they don't know how this is going to turn out. Is this going to be a civil war inside a civil war? After all, these groups that have worked together, what we're calling these opposition forces, aren't necessarily aligned. And when it comes to the power struggle, which is already underway with the vacuum of Assad leaving, this could turn into another major civil war. And that could create a massive outflow of refugees, just like we saw before, something that Turkey certainly won't want to see. Jordan, for example, there's going to be a lot of potential for even further destabilization in the region. And I think that is what the region is looking at right now, and why they're so quick, I think, to try to talk about how to settle this without this conflict expanding internally. And I think that's going to be a very important point. For the United States, these are our partners, key allies, and it's going to go to the factor of these forces, these U.S. forces remaining in Syria. Every time we talked about this before, our regional partners, to include Jordan, to include Israel, all were concerned about U.S. forces leaving. So that's another factor that the incoming Trump administration will have to weigh when it comes to the force presence in Syria.
And just lastly, and this is a bit of a speculative question, but obviously as Assad regime premises, offices are raided by the new leaders there in Syria. Obviously lots of documents, lots of information, lots of hard drives. Is there an opportunity here for Washington to learn a bit more about what the workings of life under President Bashar al-Assad were really like, and what the nature of its relations were with other countries? Do you think that will be something that Washington will be keen to exploit?
Yes, absolutely. And as somebody who spent a career in the intelligence community, this is a huge opportunity for Western intelligence or regional intelligence to get this type of information, to find out how it was run, how it was supported financially, who supported it, and how those were done, to evade sanctions, banking regulations, all sorts of things, and to see who cooperated. These are all things that would likely have been kept in some kind of capacity if they weren't destroyed, or backups that they didn't think of destroying. And I think the intelligence community will definitely be looking for this information that would share with governments, with banking institutions and regulators alike.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Mick Mulroy, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Defense for the Middle East. Thank you very much indeed. Here with us in the studio is still Riad Kahwaji, who is our military and defense expert. Riad, there's one question that everyone is asking today. Where is Bashar al-Assad? If you were in his position, where would you go?
Several possibilities. I think Russia is a likely destination. There were reports that his wife was being treated for cancer over there. And there were rumors that he's in an Arab country. We don't know which an Arab country. It is possibilities are abundant. Iran is another possibility, but most likely, for me, I will not be surprised to see him either in Russia, most likely, or possibly in one of the countries that were trying to mediate, here in the region, in the Gulf.
Okay, and obviously, if Bashar al-Assad is no longer in the country, we don't know how long he's been out of the country for. Do you think his absence will now mean that what's left of the Syrian army will have no choice but to lay down all their weapons? Or do you think we will see a continued presence of pockets that remain loyal to what's left of the Assad dynasty?
Well, usually in such dictatorships, you have those who were the extremely loyal close circle. Usually these people leave, no longer remain in the country. They have their money outside, so they end up wherever they have their vested interest. But for the military, this is an interesting question because we did not see the military putting up a fight. This is a military that has like at least 10 divisions. So for this force of rebels to make their way from Idlib, take all of Aleppo, then Hama, then Homs, and reaching Dubai, we're talking here about hundreds of kilometers in distance, thousands of square kilometers in space that they occupied. This could not have been possible if we had 10 divisions putting up a fight. It's clear that commanders did not want to fight. There must have been some sort of interaction between the rebel commanders and these division commanders. It could be contacts from outside, from the sponsors of these groups, that allowed this to happen in such a high speed and with little bloodshed. We saw only one serious gunfight in Hama, and that was it.
Okay. Riad, stay with us because we're just going to bring into the conversation somebody else, Britain's former ambassador to Syria, Basil Eastwood, who joins us from London. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got reaction, as I've been saying, from all around the world. We've also just had Britain's Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, amongst those to react to this news, saying that if Assad's gone, that's a welcome change, but what comes next has to be a political solution. That's something we've just heard in the last few minutes. I just want to ask you, you served as ambassador to Syria between the years 1996 to 2000, which was the period of transition between Hafez al-Assad to Bashar al-Assad. That was happening as you were leaving. What are your first thoughts at the news that for the first time in more than half a century, there will not be an Assad family member in charge of Syria?
Frankly, delight. It has been an unhappy period for Syria as a whole. Much has changed over those 50 plus years, but not always for the better. But also some trepidation because Syria was a byword for instability before Assad and the Ba'ath Party took over in the early 1960s. And there must be a danger that it falls back into that sort of instability. Indeed, the various forces that have brought Bashar down now, it's not just Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, though they seem to have played a leading role, but also Druze forces from Sueda, Kurdish forces in the east, and so on. And it is perfectly possible that these forces might come to blows if they cannot find some sort of political framework within which to reconcile their differences.
Indeed, it remains to be seen if they will indeed remain united now that they've achieved their common goal, which was to topple Bashar al-Assad. I just want to ask you, I mean, you were there, as I said, for a critical chapter in Syria's modern history. I'm assuming you met Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad on more than one occasion. What sorts of people were they? What do you remember about them?
Well, Hafez al-Assad was an old man. He put on a show of being sort of a fairly genial character with foreign visitors who didn't ask him difficult questions. But anybody meeting him had to remember that he was absolutely ruthless with anybody who got in his way, had been in the past and would be in future. Bashar al-Assad at that stage, his father was preparing the way for him to take over, but he struck me as a weak man pretending to be strong. And he was in a position where he was still not in charge, so he was not able to have very serious discussions about issues at that stage. But he was, as it were, preparing to take over, and he clearly sort of grew into the job. His father, Hafiz al-Assad, made no bones about saying to me that his son had been reluctant to come back from Britain to take over after his elder brother had been killed in a car crash. But there was no sign of that when I was there, really. The young man was growing into the role. And what seemed to happen after he took over was that although he took over with ideas of liberalization and so on, the family and the system established by the family told him that liberalization wasn't going to work and he'd have to play it the traditional way. And so the brief period of liberalization came to an end. And then when all hell broke loose in 2011, he really did revert to family type and unleashed the dogs of war on his own population. And it was not a happy period at all, not only for Syrians, but also for all those surrounding Syria, the surrounding states, and indeed for Europe, which had to cope with an massive influx of Syrian refugees. So the experience of the Syrian civil war is basically that Syria matters not only to the region, but also to the wider world. And we all have an interest in a hopefully peaceable transition now. But there is almost nothing left on which the opposition can build. There is no sort of constitution or anything like that. But the constitution at the moment was put in by the Ba'ath Party and Bashar al-Assad without any form of discussion or negotiation with the various outside parties, although they had, in the negotiations that had been going on, there had been suggestions that this should happen. In the event, the constitution that exists in Syria at the moment is entirely one-sided and doesn't really give a basis on which negotiations can start. So it's not at all clear what's going to happen now. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Mr. Jolani in particular seem to be making some of the right noises, but it remains to be seen.
They do seem to be making the right noises.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry to interrupt you. They do seem to be making the right noises, as you say. They also seem extremely organized, and I'm wondering if that suggests to you some state involvement. Would you say these opposition factions operated entirely amongst themselves, or do you think they had a state sponsor?
I have no evidence, but I would be very surprised if the Turkish authorities did not have some inkling of what was going to happen.
Okay, so you would be pointing the finger at Turkey, and it's interesting that you also were saying just a moment ago that you believe that Bashar al-Assad, as some people have said, was a prisoner in a cage of his father's making, which is something that he's often described as having been. Do you think, just looking back again, that everything really went wrong with regards to how Bashar al-Assad played his cards in 2011? If he'd played his cards differently then, do you think his political career would have continued and he'd have remained at the helm of Syria?
Conceivably. I mean, it might have been different if he'd played his cards differently in 2000 when he first took over and had continued with his liberalization program then. So it's conceivable. but by 2011, I think everybody, the opposition factions, had all lost confidence in him. He had no confidence of no trust in him. So it would have been extremely difficult. But there were discussions at the time in 2011 as to whether to go down the route of trying to make compromises. But the story goes in Damascus that his mother said, "Well, you know what your father would have done, boys. Go out there and do it." And that was the way it was played.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there and move on, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Basil Eastwood, former British ambassador to Syria, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Also, my pleasure.
Well, let's bring into the conversation now Sir Michael Fallon, the former British Defence Secretary. Thank you very much for joining us once again here on Al-Arabiya News. I just want to start by asking you, is there a sense of inevitability about where we are today? And how did you feel when you got the news that Bashar al-Assad had fled Damascus?
Well, good afternoon, Tom. First, I think a sense of relief that this incredibly long and very brutal civil war is actually now has every prospect of coming to an end. It looks as if it has ended, and I hope it won't flare up again. We've never quite seen a civil war like it, where a government has used chemical weapons against its own people and brutalized any kind of opposition to the former President Assad. So if that's come to an end, then I think we should all be relieved that perhaps the people of Syria now do have a decent future ahead of them, and that they won't have to see a future outside their country. That it would be possible now to rebuild it on the basis of a plural government, which the leaders of Tahrir seem to be making the right noises about so far.
Indeed, but the goal that united the opposition there in Syria was the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and now comes a much bigger test, which is how do they find any other common ground? Because there are lots of ideologies and lots of different goals at work here, aren't there?
There are, and they've always been there, right from the start of the civil war, and in particular during the time I was involved in the campaign against Daesh, when Daesh were trying to take over Iraq and indeed Syria. There were, even then, there were a wide range of groups combining against the regime in Damascus, and all different shades of Islamist opinion and extremism were involved there. And it was sometimes very difficult to reconcile the different objectives. Nobody wanted the civil war to continue. Equally, nobody wanted Al-Qaeda, the extremist group, if you remember, were killing British hostages and threatening to take over the government in Baghdad, as well as Damascus. And there are armed groups all over Syria, all of whom wanted to get rid of Assad. And the hope now is that somehow they can combine and can lead now to a more plural government that reflects Syria. And Syria has always been a very diverse place with different groups, different tribes, and indeed different religions. And if somehow that can be done, then that's a process that the British government, other Western governments, ought to be encouraging now.
So, Michael, you seem to have suggested in the past that Russia is to blame for having prolonged the conflict. Back in 2017, you're quoted as saying that the Kremlin is responsible for every civilian death in Syria. I'm just wondering, how much of a blow do you think these developments, these last few days, have been for Russia?
Well, there's no doubt that Russia prolonged the civil war and caused it to last years longer and far more people killed than would otherwise have been the case, because they supplied weapons and they were actively involved in it. They have an air base in the country, they have a naval base in the country. So this is a big blow to Russia. It's also a big blow to Iran. And it will, I think, bring some hope to the rest of the Middle East that Iran's influence has been curtailed now, and perhaps some hope to the European continent, that Russia has now been overstretched. They weren't able to go in and save Assad because they're overcommitted in Ukraine. And this should also now be a warning to the Kremlin that in the end, the dictators can be defeated, and that Russia's long-standing meddling in Middle East politics in the end hasn't got them anywhere.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sir Michael Fallon, former British Defence Secretary, thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, I'm here with Riad Kahwaji, our resident military and defence expert. Thank you for standing by with us. Just want to pick up on what we were saying there to the former British Foreign Secretary, the implications of what's happened in Syria for Russia, because of course Russia's got that Mediterranean presence in Tartus. And I'm just wondering, do you see Russia maintaining it, or will they, do you think, be forced to withdraw their hardware and their troops from Syrian territory?
What we saw over the past few days, videos of the air defense systems S-300s being relocated to Tartus port. That drove many to believe that they might be readying them for shipment outside for fear of them falling in the hands of these rebels. Although they are far away, they are in Tartus, which is on the coastline. We don't know yet about the status, how the Russians see this, whether the Russians have already established contact with the new rulers, trying to secure their continued presence. As you remember, they have signed an actual treaty with an official government that was in power in the country. So presumably, under international law, the subsequent government has to uphold all the previous treaties, which gave Russia the right to use these bases for like 50 years. So I don't know whether that could stand, or Russia could prove itself to be useful to the next rulers, although there's the issue of the Russian involvement in crushing the rebels, previously. How will that fall? How could this be sold to the people?
Indeed, it's hard, isn't it, to imagine the Syrian people and the people that were fighting against the regime of Bashar al-Assad accepting the continued presence of Russian troops.
Exactly, but this is the Middle East, and things don't surprise me that easily. We've seen more strange things go in this part of the world.
Do you think fractures had appeared in the ranks of the army, which is one of the reasons why they put up seemingly so little resistance? I mean, there are reports they hadn't been paid properly. There are reports that young people were being conscripted because the army was desperate. They weren't adequately equipped. So do you think, and obviously they all got different views as well. They're not all from the same. They don't all have the same necessarily approach or ideology. Do you think it was fractures in the army that perhaps brought about the downfall of Bashar al-Assad?
All what happened in the past 12 days are indication that morale was low. I mean, zero, bottom low. It is also the economic situation in the country is bad. The pays are bad. So a lot of the officers refused, fled, deserted, and then the troops found themselves on their own and they just fled. This is one scenario. Another scenario was that on a higher level, commanders were also trying to give up on this regime for possible intervention from regional powers that were in touch with them, that convinced them to stay out of the fight. That's another possibility. The big thing that happened in there, and I think it is as major as the downfall of Assad, is that the Iranian proxies did not put up a fight as many had expected. Hezbollah even sent in a few thousand of its fighters, and they just fled on the last day. Many of the militias that were based inside Syria were not seen in the fight. You know, from the first day in Idlib, they just picked up and left. So Iran was the biggest loser as a regional player from what happened in Syria over the past few days.
Okay, Riad, stay with us. We'll be back with you very shortly. I'd just like to bring into the conversation Ahmad Bayram, who is the Regional Media and Communications Advisor to the Norwegian Refugee Council's Middle East Regional Office. Thank you for joining us from Amman. We've been looking at pictures of Syria throughout the course of the last 24 hours. I mean, fair to say many places make you think this is a country in ruins. What are your first thoughts and what's next for Syria?
I mean, of course, it's a new beginning, which we hope will mark a new dawn for the country, which has been decimated by conflict for over 13 years. Of course, from a humanitarian perspective, we want this to be as peaceful a transition into a better tomorrow for the children of Syria, for the families of Syria as possible. And of course, that can only happen when all sides guarantee the safety of the people and protection of everyone in the country. Of course, the Syria crisis can't be viewed without the regional surrounding crisis, the refugee crisis. You know, we're talking about millions and millions of Syrians, probably over 5 million in the region and beyond. Syria has more refugees, spread around the world than any other country as of now. So we hope that, the events of the last week or so will mark a new beginning, and people are returning. People have been displaced, of course, for years. Even in the last week or so, we have seen some displacement. We hope that it's a new chapter, and Syria deserves much safer, secure, and of course prosperous future.
Indeed, and of course, as you say, more refugees from Syria living outside Syria than people living in Syria by some estimates that I've seen. Do you think that it's premature to start talking about everyone who's been living in exile this last decade and a half starting to return home? Can they return home?
I think so, and that's because of many different factors. Of course, longing for a return home is not one of them. Everyone, I have friends and family who belong there and who, are longing for that day when they can return. But I think there are some other factors. Of course, some will have no home to go back to. Some will worry about the economic situation, which has, fair to say, has reached some very, very low levels, almost rock bottom in terms of the living conditions of some of the communities. And we know that 16 to 17 million people are in need of humanitarian aid in Syria at the moment. Of course, the return of people will add more pressure to that. But what we have been saying all these years, and it's going to be more relevant than ever, is that if they want a return of these Syrian refugees, if anyone away from home wants to go back home, they have every right to do so. And of course, they have to be supported in their areas of arrival. We have seen examples of that, happen in countries. Iraq, a neighbor of Syria's, has seen people return home after years of conflict and displacement. But these people going back home, they need the services. They need a supermarket, they need a school, they need a hospital, they need a pharmacy. And, in Syria, we know that the conditions for that, at least as of today, are not completely ready. So, again, it has to be, that return has to be voluntary, informed, and of course, top of all, safe.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Ahmad Bayram at the Norwegian Refugee Council, thank you very much for your time. Well, I'm here with our resident military and defence expert, Riad Kahwaji. Thanks for standing by. Do you think at this stage Syria looks slightly vulnerable? There are reports and images of people crisscrossing the border. Syria obviously surrounded by lots of neighbouring countries. Those borders don't look like they're being secured at the moment. People just passing freely, for example, from Lebanon straight into Syria. Is it important that they secure those borders for the security of this future Syria?
Yeah, of course. I mean, right now we have the neighbors have closed their borders because they are worried that with the situation inside Syria as is, that they're worried about their own country. So many of them have closed their borders. The exception is Lebanon, where we have something like 1.5 million Syrian refugees. And today the borders were flooded. And because this issue was causing a lot of disturbance inside Lebanon, the authorities were happy to let them out. So we saw the Lebanese borders very, bustling with lines of cars of the Syrian refugees wanting to go back, especially those who have been away for like 10 years, if not more, were supporters of the opposition. So we have this scenario. The Lebanese army strengthened its positions on many parts. They have only one border crossing, which is open now. And from the news coming from inside Syria is that the intentions is to get the Syrian authorities back on the borders within the next 24 hours or so.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us. We'll be with you again in a second. We're just hearing the Syrian opposition coalition saying it aspires to build strategic partnerships within the region and the world. And as well, of course, we're getting reaction from world leaders to all these developments. Let's speak now to Dr. Rim Turkmani, who is a Syria research director at the London School of Economics. You were born in Syria, I gather, and I just want to start by asking you, for the first time in your lifetime, I'm assuming, there won't be an Assad family member running Syria. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, I can't believe it. I still can't believe it. As I was born with Assad in power, and we just can't believe it. And it's just amazing, really. It's still a state of disbelief, but it's just incredible to discover the country. The moment this family kind of left, suddenly we're rediscovering the Syrian society. Everyone is reaching out to everyone, and people are coming out saying, well, we've always been, against them, but we couldn't tell and say. It's just incredible. It's overwhelming. Everyone is calling, very happy. There are lots of anxious people, rightly, especially those in Damascus right now. But there's a huge, huge relief. And there's also lots of sadness, lots of wounds have opened during the last few days. Lots of people who lost their loved ones, who suffered a lot. Now it's all coming out. Lots of people waiting for good news out of all the prisons that have been opened, and the news is not coming. So my heart is with all those people who are now just anxiously waiting, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, sadly.
Yeah, and Dr. Turkmani, you've given up your career to fight for what's happened today. I should say, for the benefit of our audience, you're a much respected scientist. So I'm assuming that today's date, which is the 8th of December, is going to be forever more etched into your heart.
Absolutely. I left my career in astrophysics. I was in a very good position at the Imperial College in London to work in politics, political science, and try to do the best for my country through knowledge, through research, through policy-oriented outputs, interventions. We did our best. That's the only thing I could do as an academic, is to do research, and I tried to orient it to the best of the country. And many others did the same. I'm not the only one. I know so many Syrians who went through a career shift because of what happened in Syria, and we really hope that we'll be able to now invest all of this knowledge that we built and expertise for rebuilding the country, and helping to also design inclusive political process. That's what we need now. We need a process that includes everyone. We don't need somebody to land in Damascus and tell us, hey, I'm here, I came on the back of guns, and now this is how we're going to be ruled. That's not going to work in Syria anymore. enough. So we need a process that includes everyone, where there is a room for everyone to express their needs. We need also a national dialogue process to heal all the wounds, so we can actually dare to say what we want, what happened, and reach together a vision for Syria that we can unite around. In the past, many Syrians, not everyone, were uniting against Assad, but they didn't have very clear vision as to what they want. Now they're uniting in joy. But they need to very quickly to work on a concrete vision about what kind of country they want. And I'm confident that they all want a democratic country, a civic country, where they are represented as citizens, not as a sect, not as an ethnicity. We don't want another constitutional sharing of power like that in Lebanon or in Iraq. They're not working. Thank you very much. Don't repeat it in Syria. We want something more based on citizenship right, where both the rights of the individuals but also the groups are respected. I don't think Syria can be run any other way if we want a stable and democratic country.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Reem Turkmani, thank you for your time today. Just before we wrap up, I'd like to turn back to our resident military and defense expert, Riad Kahwaji. Thank you for standing by and being so patient with us today. Just picking up on some of what Dr. Turkmani was saying there, and just to get your perspectives really on where things go to from here for Syria, how do we prevent the scenario in which Syria becomes another Iraq?
Look, so far I feel that the smoothness of this first day, let's say, it seems like things have been rehearsed. Somebody has been preparing very diligently to this moment. So allowing the sitting prime minister to continue running the country, don't fire anybody, undo what was done in Iraq, all the mistakes that ended with the state collapsing and chaos everywhere. So everybody is in its place. Get all the public servants into their offices, do your work, let the country continue running. See what happened in Aleppo. Things continued. 48 hours later, markets were open, people back to their business, and same thing seems to be moving in Damascus. Now, this is going to be until a new government is appointed. And this government should be representative of all the groups. It should have inclusiveness, it should get the Kurds, the Alawites, the Druze, everybody sitting together, talking about their aspirations, the way forward. I think there is also already, the UN is has been leading dialogue in this direction. So Mr. Anderson should bring in his team along with the groups from the Syrian side that were engaging and coming up with ideas for a future constitution for the country. Should it stay a republic as it is? Should it become a confederation? Should it become a federation? Should they have something similar to Iraq's government, like where you have a prime minister who is like, for example, in this case, like a Sunni, a president who's an Alawite with smaller powers. I mean, there's a lot of ideas that were thrown and discussed in these meetings led by the UN representative. This is where we would like to see things proceeding, and this would grow the confidence internally and externally in the next administration that would rule Syria.
Okay, so pull down the statues, but don't rip apart the institutions. That seems to be the key message. Thank you so much for joining us and for being so patient with us throughout the whole program. Our military and defense expert, Riad Kahwaji, thank you very much indeed to you. Well, that is it for this special edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.